Hi, my name is Alison. I'm a BA graduate from the University of Malta in History of Art and Fine Art, and I'm here to talk about the representation of mental illness in art. Historically, there has been a lot of negative stigma around mental illness and lack of understanding, but the situation has vastly improved, but there still remains a lot of that stigma. If you speak to people who suffer from mental illness, a common thing that is brought up is the fact that mental illnesses, a lot of the time, fall under the bracket of illnesses known as invisible illnesses, meaning that outwardly it is not obvious that a person has this illness. What that means is that their word needs to be taken on it. If you see someone with a broken leg, you know exactly what's wrong with them, and you may provide assistance to them or give them a bit more patience because you can see something's up. Whereas with invisible illnesses, mental or otherwise, strangers, bosses, even family members might not give the same amount of respect because it's not on the forefront of their minds, and also sometimes it's a case of believing. Sadly, some people just won't take their word for it, especially people who have not struggled with anything themselves and find it hard to understand. I wanted to do my dissertation on this topic because I found it very interesting that even though it's something invisible in the visual field of art, there's a long history of the investigation and delving into mental illness. I think it's a natural human thing to want to understand more something that is stigmatized and to try and visually represent something that cannot be seen. So this video will be split into 3 parts, the first of which will be the self-portraiture of artists who suffered from mental illness themselves. Second section will be the clinical aspect, so basically the medical perspective of those who are mentally ill, as well as the use of art in medicine historically, as well as the role of art in the humanization of those who are ill. And finally, in the third section, I will be discussing the representation of mental illness that's a bit more general. So while the artists may or may not have suffered from mental illness themselves, the focus here is more about the generation of empathy and perspective within a situation lived by someone other than themselves. So, part 1, the internal struggle. In some of these cases, the artist chose to focus on mental illness directly and purposefully. In others, it was inevitable, being part of that person's life and life experience, it just came through in their art. So I'll start by defining the most commonly used term, the melancholic artist. Going back in history, in the Middle Ages, melancholia was considered a form of laziness and actually a capital sin. But during the Renaissance, it gained the perspective of being a sweet, reflective sorrow, which led its way into philosophizing and seeking inner peace, which is more how we know it today. The 19th century truly romanticized this melancholic character and filled its novels and poetry with melancholic characters. But it was finally in the 20th century that we started to use the term depression to put a name to what some people were actively suffering from. To this day, however, we still really strongly associate the artist with melancholy, depression, and other mental illness, as I mentioned. And actually, there's a lot of debate about whether that's true or not. I think a lot of the time, since an artist's work really showcases their emotional state, we're more aware of the mental state of an artist than we are of, say, any other profession. You wouldn't really know by some accountant's books whether they were suffering from mental illness unless it was severe enough to mess up those books. But you would know in an introspective painting. And sometimes we have defined artists by their mental state. A number of scientific studies have been carried out trying to find a link between either general mental illnesses or specific ones or symptoms and intelligence and or creativity. And the results are all across the board. So there is no definitive truth on whether they're linked. What we do know is that artists have played a major role in representing what a lot of people feel, and that artists going through struggles internally have helped a lot of people feel like they are seen and heard, which is amazing. So we cannot discuss artists who are intrinsically linked with their mental health without bringing up Vincent van Gogh. Born in 1853, Van Gogh was formally diagnosed with a form of epilepsy, but we know a lot more about his mental state than maybe most artists of his time, because we have quite a few records, including his doctor's records and his own letters, which have told us a lot about what was happening in his life. Interestingly, his most productive artistic period was during the worst phase of his mental health, featuring mood swings, outbursts, amnesia, psychotic episodes, all of this heightened by his absinthe habit and possibly bipolar disorder, although that can't be confirmed because you cannot diagnose a person who is not living. So these months in which he was suffering so much are actually the time in which he consolidated his artistic style, and he actually did believe in a link between his mental state and his productivity as an artist, and said, and I quote, "The more I am spent, ill, a broken pitcher, by so much more am I an artist." When talking directly about portraiture, his self-portrait with a bandaged ear and self-portrait with a bandaged ear and pipe are the only paintings which directly visually show his mental illness, as he damaged his ear during a psychotic episode. However, regardless of subject matter, his works from the time period are highly evocative, and a very subjective experience is shown through color and technique, which really paints a portrait of what he was feeling at the time. Another artist whose work is inextricably tied to their health is Frida Kahlo. Like Van Gogh, Kahlo strove to really portray her anguish and suffering, but unlike him, she chose to make it the forefront of her imagery. Out of some 140 works produced, at least 50 of them were self-portraits with direct references to her mental and physical illness. Frida Kahlo had a lot of physical pain due to an accident that badly damaged her spine, but the constant pain and bed rest definitely negatively affected her mental state. She's also have thought to have suffered from an array of mental illnesses, including depression with 2 major depressive episodes and suicide attempts, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, and dissociative identity disorder. In works like Broken Column, you can really see her sense of isolation and distress at her physical state, but then there are works like My Birth, where the focus is more on that sense of worthlessness she felt due to her family situation. A lot of her paintings have to do with her tumultuous relationship with Diego Rivera. Paintings such as Memory, The Heart, and The Two Fridas are great examples of the way she portrayed the way that affected her and made her feel. And another major work to reference is Henry Ford Hospital, which deals with the infertility and frustrated motherhood that she dealt with. Kahlo's work is very interesting because she chose to make the dehumanizing effects of her physical and emotional pain the central subject of her work, therefore trying to bring the humanity back into herself and helping others recognize that humanity. So while paintings like Van Gogh's are incredible for people who are suffering themselves to feel that sense of not being alone and feeling a connection without direct expression, Kahlo's works are incredible in the opposite sense at making people who have not experienced this pain and suffering really come to understand what she is feeling in a very direct way. So far, I've mentioned two artists who chose to put their mental health on the forefront of their art. However, that's not always a choice someone is able to make. An amazing example of this is the artist William Utermohlen. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Born in 1933, he was an American artist based in London who was particularly known for his very precise draftsmanship and expressive capabilities. Utermohlen went through a number of different themes and subject matters in his long life. However, it's his final two phases which are of particular interest to us and the subject matter we're discussing. The artist was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at the age of 65 in 1995. Obviously, this had a major effect on his art going forward, but retrospectively we can actually see the effects of the disease in his earlier 1990 to 1991 series called Conversation Pieces. Looking at the series chronologically is very telling as we see Utermohlen unravel from a very realistic depiction of his home's interior to increasingly disoriented composition, likely stemming from the degradation of spatial awareness that is part of the disease. The psychiatrist Dr. Patrice Pollini interprets the theme of this series as a way to record and capture the most important parts of his life. She also discusses the significance of Utermohlen's own place in these works. In some, he's represented by an empty place at the table. In others, he's entirely absent. In the final two works of the series, Snow and Bed, his self-portraits are isolated from other people by either distance or sleep. Once officially diagnosed, Utermohlen decided to investigate what was happening to him with self-portraiture, and he focused entirely on this until he lost his ability to draw in the year 2000. His wife insisted that, like Kahlo and Van Gogh, this fascination was entirely self-motivated, and that he actually impressed medical staff with his ability to keep drawing after a time that he had lost a lot of other basic abilities. The progression of his self-portraits is a heartbreaking devolution from a man gazing determinately at the viewer to a blank-eyed individual with a gaped mouth to an almost abstract shadow of a face with two black smudges for eyes in his final drawing. The degradation in skill is nowhere near as interesting as the emotion that he still manages to infuse, a terror, confusion, and deep sadness. For me personally, it's the erased self-portrait from 2000 which feels most intimate, as it's left unfinished and messy, something that a skilled draftsman of his youth would have shuddered at. It bears the echoes of 2 years of frustrations of trying to get it right, ultimately failing as he succumbed further to the disease. There's also much to be said about the stylistic representation of mental illness, particularly the use of blacks and distortion in 20th century expressionism. Among these are the works of the Scottish painter Pat Douthwaite, who suffered from bipolar disorder and is known for her very dark and nightmarish scenes. She depicted the darker side of the human condition with skeletal figures and damaged limbs and sharp teeth, hollow eyes, but each of her figures are painted or drawn with exquisitely executed and distinctive outlines. The colour black is ever present in her work. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a big advocate for not all self-portraits necessarily being self-portraits, and Pat Douthwaite very much agreed with that. She would call her works indirect self-portraits and said, "I am painting myself over and over again. There are masses of self-portraits in disguise, with small facets of other people, real or imagined, juxtaposed it all. As George Eliot said, there are many women inside me." Many parallels can be drawn between her work and the works of Francis Bacon, particularly the black triptychs, which were painted after the death by suicide of Bacon's former lover, George Dyer. The works also make heavy use of black and distorted figures, showing moments before, during, and after Dyer's death. In this case, it was Dyer who suffered from alcoholism and depression, while Bacon himself was dealing with grief, loss, and a sense of guilt that came with a loved one passing away by suicide. Similarly, in the works of Kathe kollwitz, we find a lot of depiction of the suffering and loss caused by both world wars, particularly in her later expressionist works. Here too, the figures are distorted, huddled, and often printed or etched in layers of black. Kollwitz's mental state undoubtedly played a role in this. She is thought to have suffered from anxiety during her childhood due to the death of her siblings, particularly her sibling Benjamin, who died at a very young age, and she lost a son and a grandson during the World Wars. So death and loss played a major role in her life. What makes her work so powerful is that it transcends her own suffering and loss to encompass the hardships and turmoil of an entire generation, producing portraits that are both universal and at the same time extremely personal. Part 2. The clinical understanding. It's important to consider the role of imagery in clinical context. Art created for the purpose of study and illustration, as well as the artist's own personal interest in the treatment and observation of those suffering from mental illness. Psychiatry is one of the more recent fields in medicine, and the treatment of the mentally ill has progressed a lot since its advent. From the somewhat absurd belief in the Middle Ages that madness was caused by a stone in the head, as seen in Hieronymus Bosch's Extracting the Stone of Madness, the mentally ill would remain medical mysteries and a shameful part of society for a number of centuries to come. It wasn't until the 19th century that there was a shift in public opinion of mentally ill and those who treated them. Where previously mad men and women would be sent to the madhouse, now lunatics were sent to the asylum, which in our modern ears may sound like exactly the same thing, but back then those were medical terms, and giving it a medical term meant respect. In the same way, what was previously known as a mad doctor was now a psychiatrist or an alienist, and with the new branding came along a new shift in the public perception. Philippe Pinel, who was the founder of this new wave of psychiatry, helped change a lot in both the public perception but also in what went down inside the treatment. So he helped do away with things like bleeding and purging and tried to focus on more intellectual and effective treatment of those suffering from mental illness. It was also Pinel who initiated the use of portraiture in the study of the mentally ill, commissioning diagrams of patients' skulls due to a belief at the time, known as phrenology, that the shape of the skull actually told you a lot about the mental state of a patient in accordance with its lumps and bumps and dips. Pinel's discipline, gonna have to read this, Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, took it upon himself to re-establish the idea of the madman, calling his patients medical patients. Furthermore, he heavily campaigned on the notion that people were not universally insane, but perfectly mentally healthy in every area bar one, a neatly localized flaw, a condition which he called monomania. One channel of publicity for alienists was the use of visual representations to aid in the delineation of psychopathological classification and therapeutic methods. Medical experts of the period believed in another, now considered pseudoscience, like phrenology, this time physionomy, believing that particular facial features and expressions were indicators of particular mental illnesses. Unsurprisingly, this is where the art comes in. Esquirol commissioned artists, painters and sculptors to paint portraits and take casts of his patients, which he then published in a major publication called De Maladie Mentale in 1838, and it contained 27 engraved portraits of individual patients by Ambrose Tardot, mainly profile busts and unposed full-length studies of patients in straitjackets and restraining chairs. Later, a series of drawings produced by Georges-François-Marie Gabriel, also commissioned by Esquirol, were made for another medical publication, but then also featured in a salon, the Salon of 1814, in which Jean-Louis Theodore Géricault also exhibited several works. Not long after that, Esquirol's disciple and close friend, Etienne Georgette, would commission Géricault to paint paintings of his patients, inspired by the works produced for Esquirol. There's a certain style to these works, as seen in Gabriel's A Maniac and A Maniac Cured. In the first, we see a woman with contorted facial expression, eyes rolling wildly and seemingly unaware of her surroundings, and that's contrasted by the second depiction of a calm and docile woman gazing intently past her viewer. Stylistically, these bear a lot of resemblance to Géricault's canvases, with thinly veiled tension in their pursed lips and knitted brows. However, Géricault's portraits go a step further than these earlier engravings. The vibrant colour and depth of contrast, along with the detail afforded by a large oil painting, present an image that's far more tangible. The monomania of envy, portraying a woman known as the hyena of Salpetiere, is a marvellous example of a portrait that clearly shows the physiognomy Georges wishes to highlight, whilst removing the sense of alienation, thus opening the door to compassion. The portrait's strong colour scheme of white bonnet, pale skin, and red dress against her black robe on a black background served to emphasise her centrally framed face, drawing the viewer into her expression of distrustful consideration. The work ultimately established an entirely realistic representation of the woman without any loss of her character. These portraits started as studies of a scientific nature, but they amount to so much more than that. They expose the humanity in the victim of the mental illness and align the viewer with this distinction, therefore giving them a sense of worth, which is an integral first step in their recovery. Georgette and Géricault's perspective on the mentally ill were both liberal and forward-thinking. Their stylized renderings produced humanized, approachable, and relatable figures, powerful enough to contribute to a shift in the perception of the mentally ill, and promote a sense of solidarity with the human condition and the experience of suffering in its various forms. The need of medical professionals to commission artists for portraits, illustrations, and so on of medical situations would soon decrease with the advent of photography. Dr. Hugh Welsh Diamond took up photography within months of its invention and eventually used it to take photographic portraits of his patients in a female ward of a mental asylum. This is a case in which the medical professional was also the artist, as Diamond became as well known for his photography as he was for his medical career. He was an innovator in photographic techniques to the point that he was actually rewarded for his contributions to the field. For Diamond, the practice of the fields of science and art were interrelated, using the same camera to document but also to instigate the characteristic features of different mental diseases in their commencement, continuance, and cure. It's also interesting to note that Diamond also formed part of a group of forward thinkers who, in this case, advocated for the insane and were very much against the use of restraints. He also believed in visual art therapy and considered showing his patients their own photographs an integral step in the moving forward in introspection. While the purpose of the photography is no longer considered medically legitimate, as we do not believe in physiognomy anymore, the process and publication of Diamond's photographs provided the public access to the hidden depths of the mental health institution. He himself believed that photography provided faithful record, free altogether from the painful caricaturing which so disfigures almost all the published portraits of the insane as to render them nearly valueless, either for purposes of art or science. In Plate 32, most striking is the garland placed around the subject's head by Diamond himself as he was arranging her pose, likening her to Shakespeare's Ophelia, intentionally playing on Ophelia's connotations with madness in Victorian art and literature. Plate 27 establishes an air of ambiguity around the subject's awareness of the state of the dead bird she clutches in her hands. She could be in mourning, rejoicing, or simply ignorant of its passing. The fact remains that whilst the animal is dead, she endures, although almost fading into the background, signifying the effect her illness has on her existence and the small fleeting hope for a cure. More contemporary explorations of mental illness in the medium of photography can be found in the works of Raymond Dejardin, Mike Spitz, and Maya Daniels. We've talked about the asylum, and with Raymond Dejardin, we are talking about the end of the asylum. His series Mancomio was captured during the dramatic system reform in the 70s. In this case, the series of photographs were not commissioned by the psychiatrists, but taken out of interest of the artist himself. However, he was in constant communication with the psychiatrists that worked in the institution. These psychiatrists were bringing about the reform themselves, and while they noted that this was an individual situation, they also said that situations just like it could be found across the globe. Their thought on the patients was that the psychiatric hospital made them that way. Now it's too late. There's nothing else I can do for them. Take your photographs, the psychiatrist added, otherwise people won't believe us. On returning some years later, Dejardin said, "When I asked Domenico Casagrande and Agostino Pirella what would happen next, they answered outright, 'Raymond, there are no more photos to be taken. The prison is chemical now.'" Similar to Hugh Welsh Diamond, Mike Spitz is both a psychiatric social worker and a photographer who chose to combine these two fields in a project culminating in his 2013 photography book called Portraits of Mental Illness, Medicated for Your Protection. The book includes intermittent photo spreads of the psychiatric institution and life inside it. However, the focal point is sets of two straightforward black and white portraits of each sitter, showcasing different aspects of their personalities, accompanied by biographies as described by the patients themselves. The artist chose the medium of film photography for its naturalistic and gritty qualities, and none of the shots were arranged in any way. His goal was to present the individual subjects for their estrangement, isolation, and unique personality, rather than make any social political statement. This is very evident in his work, as each portrait feels like a personal story more than a journalistic endeavour. Maya Daniels' photographic series is focused on Alzheimer's and is called Into Oblivion. It was inspired by a visit to hospital where she noticed two patients peeking at her out of the glass windows of the Alzheimer's ward. This led to the focus on the locked door to the outside world, which many of the patients often stand beside, hoping to leave. Taken over several weeks between the years 2007 and 2010, Daniels spent time in the hospital engaging with the patients and documenting their lives, often involving patients' relatives and members of staff in discussions over their work. The patients' relatives gained a new perspective on their family members' lives, with Daniel stating that it allowed her to show them life inside the institution from a different perspective. In the case of the medical staff, it really highlighted the locked door and the symbolic value it held in their patients' lives. Part 3. The empathetic understanding. It would be remiss not to discuss the role of the artist, not as the sufferer or as the clinical medium, but as the observer and interpreter of the suffering of others. Many examples exist of the artist grappling with the somewhat intangible nature of those around them. For instance, Melancholia is a popular subject of Albrecht Dürer, who depicted the sufferer's contemplative nature as due to the contrast between an attraction to the celestial ideas and an intellectual perception of the self as fragile and finite. Among the works of various other artists are those of Edvard Munch and Egon Schiele and the contemporary photography of Adam Ferguson. To start with the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, he became very known for his colourful, raw paintings, which beautifully translated emotion into visual imagery. His first major work was The Sick Child, which was painted in 1885. This painting's subject matter was his dying sister Sophie and their aunt. This was a theme that he focused on and reproduced numerous times in his life, both in painting and in print. I would say one of the strongest examples of it is a lithograph which he produced in 1896, in which even her hair appears to be bleeding to death. Later on, in 1907, he double exposed a self-portrait over this image of his dying sister, placing himself in the moment of his sister's death. Whilst this isn't a story of mental illness, the topic of the death of a loved one, particularly someone so young, is a situation of trauma that many can relate to. The process of mourning is probably the easiest comparison to depression that someone can give a person that has never experienced the illness themselves. Whilst undoubtedly culturally influenced, Munch's inspiration was often taken from closer to home, depicting his own experiences and emotional reaction to these traumatic experiences. His mother passed away from tuberculosis when he was just 5, and his older sister Sophie, who had taken on the maternal role, as I mentioned, died only 9 years later of the same illness. His family didn't respond to the trauma well, with his father becoming emotionally unavailable and developing a depression of psychotic proportions, with another brother dying young at the age of 30, and his younger sister Laura developing a schizoaffective illness which required frequent hospitalization. Munch had a penchant for naming his works in reference to famous historic works, and he liked the term melancholy enough that he used it for 2 separate series. Melancholy Laura is the title he used for portraits of his sister who suffered from severe mental illness. In painted editions, his vibrant orange interiors contrast the dark and comparably dull, cool-toned figure in the centre, turning the joyful colour into an almost aggressive force. Her stare, blank and emotionless, competes for the viewer's attention with a prominently placed flowering plant pot on the table before her. In prints and drawings, the lack of colour variation is made up for with the heavy lines making up the figure. This work skillfully toes the line of exposing bare the mental suffering of the subject, while at the same time shutting the viewer out. Munch's own physical and mental health degraded over time, with alcoholism exacerbating the situation. The themes of his work were fairly negative and reflective of his paranoia and negative life experiences, although they lightened considerably after some time at a psychiatric clinic in 1906. Among the works of Egon Schiele can be found several works inspired by the clinical depictions of patients suffering from convulsive states by the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, a follower of Diamond, which were widely disseminated through illustrated journals by La Salpetiere Hospital in Paris. Schiele's nude portraits of 1910 to 1911 capture the speed of the camera with quickly posed subjects, expressive facial gestures, twisted torsos, and freely exposed genitalia, depicted on blank sheets of paper devoid of any form of context, and forcing the viewer to examine the subjects in their naked humanity. The works focus on the physical state of the subject depicted, with emphasis on muscles, skin, and the physical frame, with the mental states attached to these depictions. The study Kneeling Nude with Raised Hands self-portrait, a black chalk and gouache rendering, features this distinctive agitation in his body language, the torso seemingly fixed only by his genitalia, while his limbs flail and contort, appearing to both beckon and repel the viewer simultaneously. Moving back to photography once more, Adam Ferguson's photographs similarly explore the link between the physical and the mental in the story he produced for the New York Times about children suffering from mental health issues after being held captive by ISIS. Black and white photographs that are hauntingly lit, with captions that elicit a shudder. A pregnant young woman with wide eyes stares past the camera, holding the out-of-focus head of a seated man seemingly for comfort, with the caption reading, "Sumaya Ahmed is 21. She won't go outside and thinks about killing herself." In a 2016 study of young Iraqis, over half reported symptoms consistent with PTSD, and even more reported symptoms consisted with depression. This isn't surprising considering the nearly 4 decades of constant conflict in the country, yet mental health care is uncommon. The population of 38 million is served by only 138 psychiatrists and 60 social workers. In this case, the importance of the work of the artist goes beyond introspective reflection and becomes a tool for social and political action and protest. In conclusion, particularly in a time of crisis, the ability to empathize with people outside of your normal circles and approach others with a sense of understanding is all the more important. I truly believe that art has a very important and often underestimated role in establishing this connection. Before researching this, I had always known what an important role art had played in medical background in the sense of illustration and diagrams, but I hadn't actually realized how much of a role it played in psychiatry. Even though a lot of the theories behind why portraits were commissioned have gone out the window, their effect remains extremely important because, as a byproduct of the studies of physiognomy, we got portraits of people who were otherwise hidden from society coming out and helping people really empathize and bring respect to the profession and to those suffering from mental illnesses. In the same way, it was extremely interesting to see how mental illness has been connected to art historically in ways other than the stereotype of the melancholic artist. Contemporary scientific studies establishing a potential link between creativity and mental health is therefore all the more interesting. In a time when society is becoming more accepting of discussion of the prevalence of mental illness, I believe it's also important for practitioners of arts to be able to engage in the conversation, not only as potential sufferers, but also in raising awareness and giving dignity to those who suffer. The more studies carried out on the matter, the more we uncover about the complexities of psychology, creative expression, and the nature of humanity. For many, mental illness is a dominant part of their human experience, which they deal with every day, and art has the ability to serve as a powerful vessel to tell that story. Thank you for listening and being interested in this subject, as it's very close to my heart. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact me. The best place to do so would be my Instagram, and thank you to HoASA for asking me to do this talk.